Okay, thank you so much for the introduction. I appreciate it. Great to be here with my esteemed panelists. And good afternoon, everybody. How's everyone doing? Great. So I want to talk a little bit about cooperatives, worker cooperatives in particular. I have founded and I'm the faculty director of an organization, an initiative here at Georgetown called CREED, the Coalition for Racial Equity and Democratic Economy. And so what we focus on is closing the racial wealth gap through community wealth building initiatives that center community ownership, and particularly cooperative ownership in the form of workers, residents, consumers, owning the initiatives, the entities that are built and developed in their communities. We have experience in low income, low access communities and in underserved and divested communities, histories of extractive capitalism that's basically extracted income and wealth out of those communities to build the income and wealth of other communities. And so with a wide spectrum of extractive initiatives, economic initiatives and enterprises within Black and brown, poor, white, low-income communities, what CREED is focused on is trying to reverse that extractive economics by giving Black, brown, poor people, low-income people, ownership of the enterprises that are created, thereby keeping that income and wealth in those communities longer than would otherwise be the case. And the hope is that by keeping the income and growing the wealth in those communities, you will begin to create, supply chain integration in which other businesses within the ecosystem will sprout up to support those businesses that have been initiated and started as cooperatives, and that individuals within those communities will be able to keep that income and wealth longer to grow their bank accounts and to grow their wealth in a way that's not possible when that income and wealth is being extracted to build the wealth of middle management, C-suite management, shareholders who own the corporation, so forth and so on. So our first initiative at CREED is focused on food sovereignty and food security. And we're partnering with an outfit called National Co-op Grocers to bring 5 consumer and worker-owned co-op grocery stores into areas that are underdivested and divested, primarily in DC, Wards 7 and 8 east of the river, wards that have a disproportionate number of residents who are below the poverty line, who are below the median wage income of DC and of the region. And that is, wards that are predominantly Black, 90% Black. This is a city that used to be called Chocolate City a long time ago, right? When the Black population was about 70%. Now the Black population is under 50%. The city has gone from being called Chocolate City to Cappuccino City to Cafe Latte City, So the progression continues. But not to be so humorous about it, it has resulted in some very harsh and rigid displacement of Black and brown people from this city. And the numbers of homeless individuals, those numbers have swelled. And the number of out migrants to east of the river, whose populations have increased during this period of time, and outside of the city, particularly to Prince George's County, has been notable. We have suffered in DC from the greatest percentage of displacement of any major city in the country, right? So many of these individuals, many of these families displaced have not had, unfortunately, the resilience, the wherewithal, the wealth to be able to stay in their homes, homes that they own, but because property taxes were increasing given gentrification, were displaced, or who were renters and were displaced because of a number of factors, not the least of which was the increasing rental rates within the city, right? So what we want to try to focus on is how do we put a dent in that problem? How do we prototype and blueprint solutions that can be rolled out, scaled in this region, but also to other major urban centers around the country, right? But first, just a little bit about cooperatives. A cooperative, as you guys probably know, is a member-owned and controlled enterprise, right? Which automatically sets it apart from investor-driven, investor-oriented enterprises. This is not a situation where you can, because you purchase the most shares of the investors in a business, you have all the say in who is appointed to the board and how the entity is governed, right? In a cooperative based on one person, one vote, every worker, every member of that cooperative has an equal say in appointing or electing the board, and of that board representing the entire cooperative. So it's a very egalitarian, democratic approach to governance, and is basically I think, a great training ground for democracy, which, as we know, all around the world is under assault, right? So a cooperative is a member-owned and controlled enterprise where the members can be consumers, like REI, for instance, that you guys probably all know is a consumer co-op. The members can be producers, like Ocean Spray. We might have some Ocean Spray products over there. It's a farmer and agricultural cooperative owned by the farmers of that cooperative. It might be a residential, cooperative like Co-op City, which is the largest housing residential cooperative community in the country, in the Bronx in New York. A worker cooperative, then, what we're here to kind of learn more about, is a type of cooperative, a business organization, where the employees or workers own and democratically control the company. They are the members who own and control the company, right? And the profits are shared among the workers. So this model, as I said, differs from traditional businesses where ownership and decision-making authority are typically held by a small group of individuals or shareholders who are investors in the business. There are approximately 40,000 cooperatives of all kinds in America: consumer, producer, worker, resident, so forth and so on. 40,000 cooperatives. Approximately 40% of all Americans belong to some kind of cooperative. You wouldn't think it in America, but that's the truth of the matter. Approximately 120 million Americans belong to credit union cooperatives alone, right? Few really know what a cooperative is, however, although so many of us belong to some form of cooperative. Very few of us know about the impact that cooperatives do have in our communities and can have if we understood them better, if we supported them more, if we financed them adequately and created an ethos in which cooperatives are really seen as a viable form of business alternatives in American society. There are approximately, however, only out of that 40,000 cooperatives, there may be 400 worker cooperatives, right? Only 400. And so there's a lot of work to be done, I think, in increasing the number of worker cooperatives in this country that I think will have the greatest impact with regard to closing income gaps and wealth gaps in America. Look, there are a few reasons why I like cooperatives, and I think it needs to be that they need to be given more of a foundation and springboard as being part of, integrated into our economy and being a part of our economy. First of all, cooperatives are sticky businesses. So I run a practicum on the solidarity economy. And the portfolio of that practicum has shifted over the years, where I now represent a lot of solidarity economy practitioners, right? Probably, 2/3 of the individuals and entrepreneurs that I bring in are within the solidarity economy. They're starting cooperatives, perpetual purpose trusts, land trusts, so forth and so on. And the reason I made that shift is because of experiences I was having in representing conventional entrepreneurs. I think that the gap with regard to Black and brown and women entrepreneurs is much lower than white male entrepreneurs, for instance. And so my practicum was focused on trying to close that gap. But what I would find year after year is that I would invest a lot of money, pro bono money, into companies that were at first situated maybe east of the river or in some low-income, underrepresented community. But after they started to do well, largely because of the $70, $80, $100,000 of pro bono assistance I would pour into them over a year or two, they would leave the communities, right? And of course, I have no say-so over that. On the one hand, conventional economists will tell me, well done, Cook. What you've done is provided a, launch pad for, Black, brown, female entrepreneurs who can, under the rules of capitalism, can decide to go everywhere. What are you, a socialist or something? You don't want to just tie them down to any one community. And, there's some truth to be said to that, which required me to address, I think, and to rectify my approach to representation as an attorney, as someone running this practicum. How could I lend my scarce and valuable resources more to businesses that had a better chance of staying in communities that needed them most over the long run, rather than uprooting within a short period of time? So that's why I shifted to the solidarity economy approach, because what's been proven with regard to cooperatives is that they are sticky. They tend to stay in the communities where they were created for longer periods of time, right? So rather than being uprooted and going to another community and leaving that community in the same position it was in before the cooperative was stood up, they're there over that period of time. And more importantly, being there for long periods of time, it alters the ethos of the university, of the community. It helps for young people and not so young people to be able to see an entity that they own, an asset, a community asset that's within their communities, right? Many of them begin to get aspirations about being entrepreneurs themselves. Those who are working inside cooperatives, they are managing a business, they're running a business. You develop all kinds of skills when you have to run a business, right? When you have to weigh in on the accounting, the finances, the products that are offered, the services that are offered, when you have to weigh in on all of the decisions pertinent to running a business. So studies have indicated that, if you are part of a cooperative for any extended period of time, you tend, if you leave cooperatives altogether, to be a better entrepreneur. If you start your own business, right? You tend to be a better and more competent civic leader. You tend to be interested in civic things in your community more than would otherwise be the case. There is something, in other words, that is kind of contagious about the democratic elements and the business operating elements of a cooperative, that even if you are a conventional or neoclassical, neoliberal economist about individual, development and business, growth and development, right? There are many more ways. There are not many ways better than a cooperative to provide a person with the ecosystem of training, workforce development, entrepreneurial development to get them started on the road to entrepreneurship than cooperatives, right? So cooperatives are sticky for that reason, and I tend to like them. They stay in communities and have impacts in communities over longer periods of time. Cooperatives have a strong multiplier effect as well, right? In the ecosystem that we're trying to create around Rosie's Grocery is the name of the grocery store that we've named it, Rosie's Grocery. Rosie's Grocery will be 5 locations, 1 store, 5 locations in the DMV to create economies of scale. Those grocery stores will increasingly exert a serious demand on other businesses with regard to supply chain. They'll need, all the things that grocery stores sell. So all of a sudden now, the farmers in communities have, somewhere where they can, sell their products to, right? And we plan as part of our strategy to organize those farmers so that they are part of the supply chain into Rosie's. There are all other kinds of things, professional and legal and business services, support services, and other items that are sold within catering aspects of the business that will require that other entrepreneurs be a part of this venture, right? There are entrepreneurs who, what they do all day is they make those small little delicious potato pies and chocolate bourbon pies and cakes that I eat too many of, right? That's what they do. Now all of a sudden in a Rosie's grocery store chain, they have a place to sell their product. They can grow their business that way. So you see, it has a multiplier effect with regard to all these things. Cooperatives are resilient businesses, which is another reason why I love cooperatives, right? I mean, the Small Business Administration reports that, 50% of all businesses who start in year 1, they're out of business in year 5. 50%, right? Only about 30% are surviving after year 10. There are far easier things to do in the world than start and sustain a successful business. You just as well give yourself a foot up and take advantage of everything that you possibly can, right? So cooperatives tend, right, during downturns in the economy, during hard times, they tend to be more resilient. They survive at higher rates than do conventional businesses within the same sector, right? And when you're talking about economies and communities that are disproportionately impacted by downturns in the economy, right? it's particularly important for those underinvested, those divested communities, to be as resilient as you possibly can make them. And cooperatives help to establish and secure that resilience. Cooperatives are socially responsible businesses too. Tends to be the case from the studies and empirical data that we have. And it may be because one of the core values of a cooperative is cooperatives helping other cooperatives, right? So in European countries, there are often mandatory statutory requirements to maintain a indivisible reserve pool out of which other cooperatives can be financed, right? In the States, it's normally done on a voluntary basis, of course, but that creates a pool of money in which other cooperatives can be launched, can be helped, right? And even apart from helping other cooperatives tend to be more community engaging. So you'll see them out front with regard to food drives, with regard to all kinds of community impacting initiatives. And a lot of that is because of what? The consumers who buy there are from the community. They reside in the community or around it. The people who work there tend to live there or around those communities. At any rate, it's a local enterprise, and people tend to have more of a local orientation with regard to what they do. And finally, I would say that it's about democracy training. Well, this is the next to the last one, actually. Democracy training. Democracy training, I think, is extraordinarily important in this day and time, right? So when you've got an organization where you come in and you are seen as an equal, and you have an equal vote with everyone else who is a worker owner of this cooperative, it just has a different vibe. It says something different to you and the people that you engage about this. You begin to wonder after a certain period of time, well, why can't there be more examples of this? Why am I working in this environment where my voice is appreciated, my participation is encouraged, and we're open to all of that? And my wife or significant other is going off to a job where, she or he is never asked for their opinion. And if they are asked about their opinion, it doesn't really matter, because those who govern the organization, the enterprise, are going to do what they're going to do anyway, right? When you have a culture that is antithetical to that, that is an alternative to that, then it tends to open up, I think, certain understandings and possibilities about democracy and what democracy really means, and why we can't have more of that kind of democracy, even in the political sphere where we're supposed to have it, right? Why can't we have even more of it there? But certainly in the workplace, why can't we expand this culture and have more of it there? So democracy training, I think, cannot be underestimated. It's very important. Cooperatives build wealth for low-income residents and communities, and they do so by basically providing alternatives to extractive forms of capitalism, right? Over this process of, incubating this Rosie's Grocery Initiative, we've had the opportunity to talk to a lot of people about, what goes on in the Safeways and Giants and other grocery stores in the community. And the stories that we have heard and chronicled are absolutely horrifying to a large extent, right? We've had workers tell us that, there is a process, well-defined and common, by which food that is close to expiring in white communities, that food is taken, transported to the Safeway, the Giant, the store in or near the Black community, and sold there, right? And the person who told us this says sometimes at a higher price, right? There is a practice of what's called refreshing meat, in which meat that looks, you've seen the meat and it looks dull and brown, you're not gonna get that. You can go for the red meat because, it seems like it's fresher, right? Well, they will take blood and pour over the brown, meat to make it look fresher, right, than it really is. And they will sell that in Black communities, right? The stories coming from Black shoppers of the disparity in quality of produce and products in Black and brown communities compared to white communities is a very common kind of experience, right? A number of these stores will not only treat their customers in that way, their patrons in that way, but when they decide that the economics no longer works and they've got to move, they will leave without consulting, without saying a word to those communities. We've had Safeways in Seat Pleasant and other places, and some even on the verge right now, the few that remain east of the river, who are not consulting and engaging communities about how they could do what they do better, how they could improve what they do, asking for their honest opinion and assessment of a situation and getting them to weigh in on stuff. That's my 2-minute warning. Okay. They don't do that, right? Instead, they'll pick up in the middle of the night and be gone, right? Like Art Modell moving to Indianapolis, the Colts from Baltimore to Indianapolis, right? I mean, that's what happens within this ecosystem. So how good is it to have a situation in which individuals are giving a true substantive voice in the running of businesses in their community? So that if a business is shut down, it's done so with the consent of the community, after having carefully interrogated and analyzed all the weighting and competing concerns to determine that that's what needs to be done. And if it is to be done, it needs to be done in a certain way that maintains a commitment to our values of equity, of democracy, of equality, and of real participation. The extractive economics that's underway is one in which, as I said, those profits are routinely sucked out of those communities, even when they are so horrifically treated in the examples that I just gave you. And those profits don't stay in the community. They go to support the regional staffs, the HQ staffs, the headquarters, the C-suite, the shareholders of those organizations, right? And we look at that as being natural. And I encounter in my relationship with communities that I'm working at, they don't understand that model of economics and what it's intended to do to keep those communities impoverished. And instead, when they don't have a grocery store, sometimes their position is, we want a grocery store in our community that's just like the grocery stores that white people have in their communities. So we want a big Safeway that's 40,000 square feet, a Giant that's 50,000 square feet. That's what we want, right? Not really understanding that that model is constructed when it does show up in their communities to do anything but be fair and equitable and really concerned about the needs of the community. So there's a real education process that has to go on here, right? The same is true with regard to extractive capitalism of the place where we now meet, right? In the 1800s, this university owned thousands of slaves, right? Owned thousands of slaves that financed its operations and financed its vision then of all that it could be. When they were on the brink of bankruptcy, about to close down, they made the decision to sell 272 black people who were their slaves, Jesuit slaves, into Deep South slavery in Louisiana, right? That money allowed them to stay open, to flourish, eventually prosper, and to be Georgetown University that we now know today, right? The extractive economics, extractive capitalism is not relegated to, the cruel, stereotypical capitalists, right? Is present even in religious institutions controlled by Jesuits, huh? So our process of trying to foster a cooperative ecosystem is really about providing an alternative to that form of extractive capitalism that still continues to pay huge dividends for banks, corporations, cities, and institutions like Georgetown hundreds of years later, right? This movement is in part about trying to revamp that. So I'll leave you with a statistic that always is a startling statistic to me and points to, I think, why we should take worker-owned cooperatives more seriously and integrate them into our understanding of what economic policy should be, what community engagement and development should be. And the statistic is this: if only 30% of U.S. businesses were worker-owned, the median wealth of black households would increase from 24,000 to 106,000. So when you're talking about a racial wealth gap that has been largely created from the legacy, the horrific legacy of slavery to segregation, from segregation to mass incarceration, from mass incarceration to redlining and other forms of gentrification, right? When you're talking about that long 400-year legacy that has been created, this wealth gap, we have to have every tool at our disposal to correct that and to try to recalibrate the disparities that have been exacted and put in place and imposed by this history, right? In DC, in the DMV, right? White median family wealth is 81 times that of Black median wealth. 81 times that. That's crazy. In one of the richest cities on the face of the earth, right? That there's that kind of wealth gap. And that wealth gap is not disconnected from that history that I just chronicled, right? So if we understand that, and we accept that, and we move on that premise, then what we have to envision with regard to an alternative economic system that is fair, equitable to Black people, brown people, even many poor white people in this country, right, is the task at hand. Thank you.